Hello everyone, welcome back to the NPTEL course on materials informatics. In this lecture we will be discussing some ideas of transfer learning and their use cases in material science. Okay. Just to recap what we discussed in the last lecture. So, we looked at interatomic potentials as an important tool for simulating dynamics in systems, and we looked at examples of machine learning interatomic potentials, and then we also looked at classical versions of machine learning interatomic potentials and how their accuracy and transferability can be improved, and also learning rates can be improved by using message passing, equivariance and high body orders within graph based networks. So, we also looked at examples of Maze and NCWIP, which are two classes of graph based machine learning interatomic potentials that are quite popular in the recent past. So, with the start of interatomic potentials and machine learning interatomic potentials, we began sort of the advanced module of this course. So, we will be continuing that in this lecture, which will focus on ideas of transfer learning and their use cases in material science and engineering. All the schematics that I will be showing you, unless otherwise mentioned, are from these three sources. So, these two are published articles from our own research group, and this is article that is under review as of recording. So, unless otherwise mentioned, the schematics are from one or all of these three sources. So, let us get started. So, if you think about material science or materials engineering as a domain, it is a domain that is fairly data constrained. So, what do I mean by that? So, if you think about diffusion of ions within solids. So, for example, if you take the case of electrode materials in lithium ion batteries, you actually need the lithium ions to move or diffuse from one side to another through some kind of an intermediate site here for the battery to actually charge or discharge. So, for the battery to either store energy or release energy. So, for either of storing or releasing energy, lithium motion is actually crucial. But if you think about for how many different systems you actually have this lithium motion quantified, right, be it in the form of diffusivities or what are referred to as migration barriers that govern diffusivities. There are only a few let us say 100 systems or so or few hundreds of systems for which these mobility data, how quickly lithium can actually move, is actually documented, right. So, this is a very important property that governs the rate at which you can charge or discharge your battery, but we do not have this information over a wide range of materials. Similarly, if you think about semiconductors, right. So, those that are used in your your transistors all the way up to your photovoltaic devices, right. So, if you look at semiconductors, their ability or resistance towards the formation of defects such as vacancies, interstitials or other dopant atoms and so on plays a very crucial role in their electronic properties, right. So, how easily are they able to create electron and hole pairs, for example, how easily are they able to move these electrons and holes through an external circuit. All of these are sort of dependent on their ability or resistance to form point defects. And if you think about semiconducting materials, right, for each material we do not have a lot of these defect formation energies or information about the ability to form defects in a wide ranged fashion. So, this is also an example of a very crucial property which is not widely known across a wide range of materials. Another example is also in the field of catalysis. So, in catalysis you typically have a surface that enables a chemical reaction, and that enabling of a reaction is usually because of some kind of reactant molecules adsorbing onto this surface, right. So, these adsorption energies are quite crucial to sort of estimate the ability of an underlying catalyst to actually enable a chemical reaction. And if you think about adsorption energies, we do not have a lot of diverse data. So, in the sense that we do not have a lot of adsorption energies of different molecules on different surfaces, right. So, we only have data points for a few thousand systems or so. So, if you look at all of these different aspects, right. So, all of these different properties of materials, these all crucially determine the performance of different applications. So, batteries, semiconductors and catalysis, but then we don't have a lot of data about the crucial properties that govern the performance of these applications. And we can sort of take other examples as well of how limited in terms of data material science as a domain is. Right. So this is very different from regular computer science vision problems, right. So if you want to design neural networks that detect images or that detect objects on the road and so on, you have lots of data available typically, but in material science we do not have a lot of data. So most of the curated data sets that you may come across in materials will typically have of the order of about 10,000 or fewer data points. So if it is 10,000 data points, that is actually a good data set that you have access to. And since we have small data sets, it sort of limits the applicability of any deep learning frameworks that we can actually use in the field of materials. So remember, the deep learning frameworks have a lot of weights and biases, because you have several sort of mathematical operations that you actually go through, right, in order to generate your final set of embeddings and then your final set of predictions. So you have lots of weights and biases that go into your different convolution operations, that go into your different message passing operations and your eventual predictions as well, which is usually done by an MLP. So this really, so since we have deep learning frameworks have a lot of weights and biases, and if you have very few data points, that would almost always indicate that the model becomes highly variant. In other words, the model will tend to overfit, right. So this sort of limits the applicability of deep learning frameworks in the field of material science in general. Now one way to sort of overcome this data insufficiency problem is to use this principle of transfer learning, right. So in transfer learning, what we typically do is we use deep learning frameworks. So we use neural networks that are fairly deep or fairly complex in nature, but what we end up doing is we end up pre-training this network on a fairly large data set and then transfer its knowledge and fine tune it on a small target data set. Right. So I will give you a vision example for this. So let us say you want to classify images of tumors as either being malignant or cancerous or benign or harmless, right. So the tumors can be of two types, so they can either be benign or they can be malignant, right. But let us say you do not have a lot of images, especially with labels, right, corresponding to benign tumors and malignant tumors. Let us say you only have a few thousand of them. So it may be very difficult for you to train a simple deep convolutional neural network on just this data, right, at this data set, because it is fairly small in terms of its size. So what you can end up doing is that you can actually download a bunch of cat images from the internet. So this is fairly easy to obtain. You can obtain millions of images, and you can sort of pre-train a convolutional neural network. Right. So you take the same convolutional neural network that you wanted to use for this task, right, but then you pre-train it on this task of classifying whether an image is cat or not cat. So it is able to when after fully being trained, your network should be able to classify whether a given image is a cat or it is not a cat. So it becomes good at a classification task. Now what happens in your convolutional neural network is that in the earlier portions of your neural network, right, you pretty much learn to recognize different features, textures, parts and so on, right. So the earlier parts of the lower layers of your network are basically dedicated in understanding how your network should actually read an image. Right, and it is only in the final few layers that your network puts together all the information and then identifies whether an image is cat or not cat, right. So in principle you can actually use all of the information that has been learnt here, right. So all of this information basically tells you which are the important features, right, to read from an image, right. So you can basically transfer this knowledge into your target task, right. So how do you actually transfer this knowledge? You take the network architecture as is and then you transfer the weights and biases. Right. So you can actually transfer it to a new task and then pass the transferred knowledge, and then you can just replace the final sort of prediction head that you have, or final few layers, right, which put together the final pieces of your image together, and then you basically fine tune on this task of classifying your tumors. Right. So basically your network has transferred most of its knowledge and then it has now fine tuned or oriented or relearned the task of identifying whether your tumors are cancerous or not. So your network has now learnt on a fairly small data set, and your network will be more accurate and more transferable than the case where you would have trained the entire network from scratch on this target data set. So this idea of transferring knowledge from one set of training to a different set of training is what is referred to as transfer learning, right. So transfer learning is a fairly well established technique in vision problems. Let us now check whether transfer learning is useful within material science as a field. If it is useful, what are some of the optimal ways to use it, and are there also ways to generate or create what are referred to as generalizable models. So generalizable models are basically models that understand structure property relations in an abstract sense. So they are not particularly good at predicting any particular or any specific property, but then you should be able to fine tune these models very quickly on a target property. So you should be able to fine tune them and then be able to make predictions on a target smaller data set or smaller property, right. So we will also explore whether there are ways to create generalizable models, and as an extension of these two questions we will also see if there are practical use cases of using transfer learning. So are there actual material properties which can be efficiently predicted by using transfer learning as a principle. Okay, so if you want to now start exploring transfer learning, right, as a tool, it is just another machine learning framework. So you have several handles to consider or several things to think about, right. First is what kind of data sets are you going to use, right. So what data sets are you going to use for pre-training, so training your model initially, and also fine tuning your target property, right. So so data sets is one thing that we have to consider. And we will sort of look at how what kind of data sets we have considered in our own work, which will be a good learning exercise for all of you. The second thing is beyond data sets you also need to consider what kind of architecture you would use for a given transfer learning exercise. So we have talked about graph neural networks quite a bit in this course. So we introduced in the first module of the course as an intuitive way to model crystal structures, right, and in the previous lectures we also looked at how graph networks are useful in machine learned interatomic potentials, right. So even in the field of transfer learning where we are interested in structure property relations, graph neural networks provides us an obvious architecture because we can represent any given structure in the form of a graph, right. So we will take in graph neural networks as our architecture. And then there are various strategies that you can actually use when you do fine tuning in your transfer learning framework. So typically in transfer learning you pre-train on one data set and you fine tune on a different data set. So this exercise is called a pairwise transfer learning exercise. So it is called pairwise because you use one data set for pre-training and another data set for fine tuning, right. So that is why you use two data sets, so it is called a pairwise transfer learning or pairwise model, right. So when it comes to fine tuning step of your transfer learning, there are several techniques that you can follow. So one instance is or one example is how many layers do you actually freeze or unfreeze, right, during your fine tuning step. So do you only freeze your prediction head or the final few layers, or do you unfreeze your entire model, you allow your entire model to be updated. Those are all design choices that you have, right. So we will also look at what strategies generally work in the field of materials, and we will look at multi-property pre-trained models probably in the next lecture, and these provide an architecture to create generalizable models. And the final thing we can sort of look at is how do we optimize some of the hyperparameters and hyperparameters associated with transfer learning itself, right. So for example we are dealing with fairly restricted or small data sets, so we need to be wary of how do we actually sample the data to ensure that our model is not biased in any form, what kinds of learning rates we use especially during the fine tuning step, right, and how many data points do you have to use when you use pre-training or fine tuning. So do you have some improvement or saturation in performance as you keep increasing your, let us say, pre-training data set size or your fine tuning data set size. So these are all important hyperparameters to sort of consider when you do transfer learning. So we look at all of these handles and then we look at how to optimally use some of these handles, and when you use these optimal handles whether transfer learning is actually useful, whether it provides better performance to us compared to models that are trained from scratch. Okay. So with respect to data sets, so that is the first handle to consider. So in our work we looked at data sets from this MatMiner database or MatMiner repository. So this repository has a lot of cleaned data sets that are available. By cleaned I mean they are mostly collected from literature, some of them are through high throughput computational works, and there are also data sets that are experimental in nature. So this data set has a lot of these properties that are tabulated in a fairly easy to use fashion, and more importantly they have structures associated with those properties, so which helps us train models that sort of try to understand structure property correlations. So with respect to our work, we looked at 7 different data sets within the MatMiner repository. So starting from piezoelectric modulus, dielectric constant, phonon frequencies, experimental band gap, average shear modulus, this is computational band gap, and formation energy. So these are the abbreviations that we will be using throughout these lectures. I mean I will be mentioning these abbreviations to in the footer space, right, for all of the slides that we will come across. And you also see that these data sets are of varying sizes. So for example, band gap and formation energies are some of the largest data sets that you will find, right. So these you have more than about 1 lakh structures, right, for which you know computationally what the band gap is and also computationally what the formation energy is, right. But then you also see data sets that are fairly small in nature, right. So data sets that are barely about 1000 data points here to about 10,000 data points here, right. And the data set also has a mixture of computational and experimental experimentally estimated values. So experimental band gap is an experimental data set, the remaining 6 data sets are all computational in nature, right. So we considered all of these 7 data sets, and what we did was we split that into 90-10 ratios, so 90% for training and 10% for testing, and the training itself the training data set itself was also used for validation, so for optimizing some of our hyperparameters, and both the training and the test data sets were basically standardized and normalized, so that there are no scaling issues, but the statistics that we used were from the training data set. So we scaled and normalized we standardized and normalized the test data set using training data set statistics, right. So we get these normalized train and test sets, which is what we sort of use in training our models and also in evaluating our models. The other important point to note is that against what kind of models do you actually estimate or benchmark your performance, right. So in other words, if you want to ask the question if is transfer learning actually useful, you need to compare that to something, right, and that comparison comes from scratch models. Right. So scratch models are basically models that are trained as is. So you take the same architecture that you are using for your transfer learning process. So you take the same architecture. In transfer learning you would do pre-training first and then you would do fine tuning later, but you can take the same architecture and then train directly on the target data set, the fine tuning data set from scratch, right. So without doing any kind of pre-training. So these models are referred to as scratch models, right. So the scratch models basically represent an apples to apples comparison. So if you didn't do any pre-training, how well your models actually perform on your target data set versus if you actually did some pre-training, do you see any improvements in your performance. So the training the scratch models are actually important because they provide us the benchmark, right, benchmark of and help us understand whether transfer learning has any utility, and we basically use the 90% of training data set. So this split of our data set to basically train our scratch models. And just to visualize how the data sets themselves are distributed, right. So this is basically your shear modulus, this is phonon frequency, formation energies, computed band gap, piezoelectric modulus, dielectric constant and experimental band gap, right. So these are basically standardized and normalized distributions. You see that this shear modulus, phonon frequencies and formation energies, these are more sort of normally distributed. You see a fairly large range of values between -1 to 1 that are actually occupied by most of the data points here, whereas these 4 properties are more sort of log normally distributed. So you see that the data distribution is fairly skewed, right. Okay, and with respect to the specific architecture, so I mentioned that you know, for the transfer learning exercises we used graph based neural networks. The specific architecture we actually used is what is referred to as atomistic line you know, graph neural network, or ALIGN. We use this ALIGN package or ALIGN framework because it takes into account not just bonds but also bond angles. So it basically takes into account 3 body interactions. So in regular graph networks, your atoms are basically your nodes and your edges are basically your bonds, right? In ALIGN you also create what are referred to as line graphs, where your nodes are basically your bonds and your edges are basically bond angles, right? So basically take into account 3 body interactions in addition to 2 body interactions. So 2 body interactions are pairs, 3 body interactions are you know, you take into account their angles. So you generate basically 2 separate sets of graphs, so bond graphs and line graphs, and they do sort of exchange information across these 2 graphs. You do convolutions, several rounds here, bond graphs and line graphs, and you do some pooling and basically go about predicting your target value, right? So we used ALIGN as an architecture, and apart from the fact that, you know, it uses bond angles as well with respect to you know, characterizing a structure, we also saw that ALIGN sort of distributes ALIGN sort of generalizes fairly well out of distribution, right. So if you presented data that is not immediately within the range of data that it has already sampled, ALIGN still made reasonably good predictions as documented in a previous work. So this was another reason why we sort of chose ALIGN. So we looked at data sets, we looked at architectures. The third thing that we should look at is basically your fine tuning strategies, right. And for this exercise we basically looked at 4 different fine tuning strategies. So this strategy here, fine tuning 3, is basically the classic strategy that is used in typical transfer learning approaches. So you have a deep you know, neural network, you know, let's say a graph neural network here, you have different convolutional layers and so on, but you only replace or fine tune or unfreeze your final prediction head. So basically you have generated your embeddings here, you only unfreeze the weights and biases in your MLP that gives you your final target. Right. So this is the classic approach of transfer learning, where you freeze all the remaining you know, weights and biases. So all of these layers, the knowledge is basically frozen, but in the prediction head alone it sort of relearns right on the fine tuning or target task. So this is a classic strategy that is used, and this typically has the lowest degree of freedom as well, right. So we consider this strategy. We also consider the exact opposite of this, which is basically unfreezing all the layers and which gives the highest degree of freedom. Right, highest degree of freedom for our model. So all of these you know, the ways you generate your embeddings, the ways you pool them, the ways the message passing is done and so on, all the weights and biases associated with all of these processes can be changed, right. So this is basically unfreezing all the layers, and this provides the highest degree of freedom for your graph network. And then we consider 2 sort of intermediate strategies. The second strategy is basically providing additional flexibility in your prediction head. So typically your prediction head takes in embeddings and then goes through one layer of you know, MLP and then gives you your target, right. So we basically introduced an additional MLP layer here, so that there is little more flexibility or learning ability in your prediction head, and you can actually you know, obtain your targets maybe with slightly better accuracy than in your classic case. So this provides an intermediate degree of freedom compared to these 2 scenarios here. So this is highest degree, this is lowest degree. We also considered one additional degree of freedom, where in addition to unfreezing your prediction head, we also unfroze the bond layers as well as the line layers or line graphs. So the bond graphs are basically encoding 2 body interactions, so we unfroze layers that were encoding these interactions to see how important these interactions were, and we also selectively you know, unfroze the 3 body interactions, the line graph terms, to see how important these 3 body interactions play in terms of the final predictions that the graph model actually yields, right. So these 2 body and 3 body layers are basically central to the ALIGN architecture itself, so we just unfroze those 2 layers to see how accurate the models actually get. So again this strategy here provides an intermediate degree of freedom between these 2 strategies. right. So the final thing to look at, the final handle to look at is basically your hyperparameters, and there are two important hyperparameters that we look at now. The number of data points, or the impact of the number of data points we look at in the following few slides. So with respect to sampling, so keep in mind that we are having fairly small data sets, so how we actually sample the data sets is actually fairly important, right, especially in our training set for our fine tuning, right. So we are basically plotting the R2 scores here of all transfer learned models. So the notation being used is, the first data set is basically what is used for pre-training, so here band gap is used for pre-training. And FE is basically the fine tuned data set. So this is the target data set, so FE is your formation energy, so you are trying to predict formation energies here. Here you are trying to predict computational band gaps, here also you are trying to predict computational band gaps, here you are trying to predict shear modulus, right. So you basically see different performances of pre-trained fine tuned models. And with respect to sampling your fine tuning data set, we sort of took into account three different strategies that you can use for sampling. One is referred to as equal sampling. So in equal sampling we take the fine tuning data set, split that into n number of equal bins, right, and then we take the same number of data points randomly from each bin, right. So that is what is referred to as equal sampling. Weighted sampling is, so you look at how the data set is distributed across your entire range, and you try to mimic the same distribution of data sets of the fine tuning data set in your test set, right. So you try to, this is similar to stratified sampling that we looked at during our very first regression exercise back in module 1. So this is basically trying to mimic that, or trying to ensure that the test set mimics your overall data set distribution, right. And the third is random sampling. Random sampling is you pick data points at random from your entire data set to create your test set, right. So these are three different ways by which your test set is actually sampled. And we found that in 3 out of the 4 cases the random sampling gave us the best performance, best R2 score. So we sort of find that random sampling is good enough for fine tuning in our materials related data sets. We also looked at which learning rates sort of work better. So learning rate is once again a very important hyperparameter, right, with with machine learning models in general, particularly with transfer learned models. So in general, if you have higher learning rates, that means that the models are updating quite a bit. That also can indicate that your models haven't generalized fairly well when the pre-training was done on them, right. So whereas if it is fairly low learning rate, then it could also indicate that the models have learnt quite well during their pre-training step, and the amount of relearning that they are doing during their fine tuning step is smaller, right. So we wanted to see what learning rate sort of works for materials related tasks. So we looked at 3 different magnitudes of learning rates, so 10 to the power -3, 4 and 5, once again for the different pre-training fine tuning tasks, right. So we use the same notation here. BG is the computational band gap, which is the pre-training data set, FE is the formation energy, which is the fine tuning data set, FE is the target data set, right. So this is the data set that we are trying to make predictions on, right. And the number in the brackets here basically indicates the number of rows and layers. So we either considered the models with lowest degree of freedom or the models with highest degree of freedom, right. So 1 and 6 here. So the sort of the main takeaway message is that across all the scenarios, across all the pre-training fine tuning scenarios, we found higher learning rates to almost always give better R2 scores on our fine tuning data set, right. So in other words, the models do need to learn or relearn quite significantly when you do fine tuning, even though you might have pre-trained them earlier on. So in at least in materials related tasks, you probably need higher learning rates in your transfer learning. So just to sort of summarize, right. So with respect to sampling, we found random sampling to be best, and with respect to learning rate, we found higher learning rates, about 10 to the power -3 to be best. We also explored even higher learning rates, about 10 to the power -2, but then we saw that our validation losses went high, so we find that 10 power -3 is sort of optimal. Okay. Let us now look at the influence of data set size, right. So the first thing that you can look at is how does fine tuning data set size actually influence, right. So we looked at the performance of both scratch models and also pairwise pre-trained fine tuned models. both the graphs sort of use similar notations, but let me go through the notations here. So the y-axis here indicates your data set, your target data set here for the Scratch model. So this is computational band gap, this is dielectric constant, this is formation energy. The x-axis basically indicates your data set size, right. So data set size for your this is the overall data set size combining both the training and the test sets, right. So within the 10 data set size, 9 data points are used for training and 1 is used for testing. Within 100, 90 are used for training, 10 is used for testing and so on, right. So these are basically 5 different data set sizes, and I am presenting basically 2 scores here. The lower triangles basically indicate your R2 scores and the upper triangles here basically indicate your mean absolute errors, and both of these scores are for test sets and these are all 5-fold cross validated, right. So in general you want higher R2 scores, so you want bluer squares, bluer rectangles, and you want lower MAEs, or you want bluer lower triangles and redder upper triangles. So this is the ideal sort of combination you are looking for, and you know, the respective scores are basically indicated in each of these squares. So all the lower triangles are R2 scores, upper triangles are mean absolute errors. On the right side we have the performance listed for the pairwise transfer learned models. Once again I am using a similar notation here. So this model has been pre-trained on formation energy and fine-tuned on computational band gap. So it is trying to predict computational band gap. So you can basically compare the performance across these this row along with this row of Scratch here, right. And then a similar thing here. So here you are pre-training on dielectric constant, fine-tuning on band gap. So it's trying to predict band gaps. So you can compare the performance along this row with the first row of Scratch, right. So here you are trying to predict dielectric constant. So this row can be compared with the second row here, and here you are trying to predict formation energy. So you can compare the last row with the last row here, right. And the data set sizes are similar. So these are all data sets of for the fine tuning step. So all of them use the same data set for data set size for pre-training. So they use the same number of data points, but for fine tuning we are considering varying number of data points, right. So from 10 all the way to about 800 here, and the notations are the same. So lower triangles are R2 scores and upper triangles are mean absolute errors, right. So this is a lot of data, so let me give you a quick summary, right. So first thing is in general pairwise transfer learned models are consistently better than Scratch models, right. So for example take the case of these the last couple of cells here that are predicting formation energies, and you can compare them with these formation energy predictions here with Scratch models. You see that both the R2 scores and the mean absolute errors are better for your transfer learned models, right, compared to your Scratch models here, right. So you see bluer redder combinations here compared to the combinations that you sort of see here, right. So in general pairwise transfer learned models are consistently better than Scratch models, and you see this behavior sort of replicating across all the rows here, right, all the rows here and their corresponding rows here. And then so this sort of indicates that transfer learning definitely has some utility, right. So you can get better performance for your models if you use transfer learning compared to if you train models from Scratch. The second thing that is fairly important here is that if you use more fine-tuning data, right, it generally leads to better models both for Scratch as well as for pairwise transfer learning. And this is sort of fairly intuitive, right. So if you have machine learning models and if you feed them more and more data, then the models are going to become better. So this is fairly straightforward. And the third is a fairly important sort of takeaway, which is that the efficiency of pairwise transfer learning is much better than Scratch learning, right. In other words, you get the same accuracy or same performance with transfer learned models at lower data set sizes for your fine tuning compared to Scratch models. So I will give you an example, right. So if you take the case of the performance of your pairwise transfer learned models that is trying to predict formation energies here, even at 500 data points, so we are only exposing to a total data set size of 500 during fine tuning of this transfer learned model, and even even upon exposure of just 500 data points, right, the R2 scores and the mean absolute errors are comparable or even better than Scratch models which were exposed to almost 800 data points, right. So you see that the transfer learned models learn much quicker in terms of number of data points during the fine tuning step compared to the scratch models, right. So in other words, the efficiency of transfer learned models, so how efficiently they improve in their accuracy and so on, is much better in terms of data set size compared to scratch models. Now we can do a similar exercise of how of the influence of pre-training data set size on the final performance of different transfer learned models as well as scratch models, right. So I am showing here the performance improvement or performance change in the performance of different transfer learned models, right. So these transfer learned models are all pre-trained on the formation energy as the pre-training data. We use formation energy because this is the largest data set that we have, right. So we can actually expose the model to different amounts of formation energy data during pre-training, right. So fine tuning data set is kept fixed, the pre-training data set size is varied, right. And we have the fine tuning performance sort of tabulated for 5 different cases here. So this is shear modulus, this is phonon frequencies, computed band gaps, dielectric constants and experimental band gaps. The baseline here indicates scratch models. So if you are above this baseline, you are basically doing better than your scratch models, right. And with respect to the data set size itself, the different colors, so different colors of the bars basically indicate what is or how much data was exposed to the models during pre-training. So all the way from 1000, 5000, 10,000 data points to about 100,000 data points here, right. And there are some useful trends to sort of know from this, right. So if you use formation energy for pre-training, we see that increasing data set size leads to a non-monotonic improvement in performance. So take this case, right. So you have an improvement in performance when you show 5000 data points compared to 1000 data points of formation energy during pre-training, but then if you show 10,000 data points, right, you actually get a dip in performance. So the performance actually becomes poorer and then it improves again. So it improves again towards 50,000 and 100,000 data points. And we see similar sort of non-monotonic behavior across all the different fine tuning data sets. For all the 5 fine tuning targets that we considered, we get the best models when we expose all the 100,000 data points during pre-training, right. So more data seems to make the models really good, right, in their fine tuning tasks. So more data during pre-training seems to help the models in their fine tuning task. And we also see that all the models that we considered here are always better than scratch, right. So there is no instance of what is referred to as negative transfer learning, where models actually perform inferior compared to your scratch models. So we did the same exercise considering computational band gaps as well, because formation energies and band gaps are the largest data sets that we have. So we considered the same slices of data, so from 1000 data points all the way to about 1 lakh data points, and we considered the same 5 different fine tuning data sets here, right. So the first thing that we observe is we do observe non-monotonicity in the performance improvements, just like we observed in formation energies. But the key sort of difference between band gap and formation energy is that we almost always get the best models when we have about 50,000 data points, right, for data sets that are non-correlated, and if the fine tuning data set is actually correlated, then we get the best performance at 100,000 data points, right. So let me explain that a little bit, right. So if we take the case of formation energy, we don't necessarily think that formation energy is highly correlated with our band gap, right. So you can have highly stable materials which have 0 band gaps and also they are insulators, right. So these two quantities are not necessarily correlated. So in such a case, we see that if you use 50,000 data points during pre-training, right, that gives better performance than if you use 100,000 data points during pre-training. But if you take the case of dielectric constant or experimental band gap, right, so these two are basically correlated properties with band gap. So experimental band gaps and computational band gaps should be correlated, and dielectric constants basically indicate how your electrons are screening, right, within your structure. So again, dielectric constants and band gaps, computational band gaps should be highly correlated, right. And we see that for these correlated properties, exposing 100,000 data points during pre-training definitely helps, right. So with band gap we do see some amount of non-monotonicity and different models or different fine tuning properties having different amounts of pre-training data set sizes to give their best performance. we can sort of attribute this variation here compared to formation energy to the way that the band gap data set itself is structured, right. So formation energy is a more normally distributed data set, so it has values ranging over all the entire standardized normalized range, so from -1 to 1. Whereas in band gaps we have a very skewed distribution of data points, so we have a lot of data points very close to -1 and we have very few data points close to +1. So that sort of skewing also matters or affects how well band gap can actually influence your model, the learning of your model during during the pre-training step. And we also noticed one instance here when we fine tuned on shear modulus where we got negative transfer. So the model was actually inferior compared to Scratch model. So we see that if you use band gap, so whether or not you get better performance depends, right. So it's better to use up about 50,000 to 100,000 data points, that almost always gives you good performance, but if you use too few data points you can get inferior performance compared to Scratch, right. So this is something to note. So the way the data set is actually distributed during pre-training and not just the size may also influence how efficiently your models perform during your transfer learning exercise. Okay. We look at the final sort of hyperparameter or strategy, which is what kind of unfreezing strategy actually helps, right, in our fine tuning. So once again we are plotting R2 scores, different contours basically indicate different R2 scores here for 4 different pairwise transfer learning tasks. We use the same notation here, so we are trying to predict band gaps here, formation energies here, directed constants here, and then band gaps here, right. The blue sort of bars indicate just unfreezing the last layer, which is giving the lowest degree of freedom during fine tuning. The red bars basically indicate unfreezing all layers, which basically gives the maximal degree of freedom. The sort of main takeaway message is that if you unfreeze all the layers, that's when you get the best performance across all the 4 different pairwise transfer learning tasks that we examined, right. So unfreezing all the layers definitely helps, right, but that also means that the models need significant retraining, right. So this is in line with the fact that models typically needed higher learning rates. So this sort of implies that the models basically have to have a lot of changes in their weights and biases for them to become particularly efficient at predicting the fine tuning property or becoming good at the fine tuning task. So the models do need significant retraining, so this is something that is important to note, which implies if you want to create foundational or sort of generalizable models, so models that are good across multiple properties, it may be difficult to do that in pairwise transfer learning. So we may need other strategies to ensure that we can create more generalizable models. And we also see that if you unfreeze 2 or 3 body terms, right, in our align architecture, in our graph network architecture, they give us the closest performances compared to unfreezing all the layers. So these 2 layers do play a major role, right, in how sort of the align architecture learns about structure property correlations. So for fine tuning strategy, as of now we find unfreezing all the layers to be the best. Unfreezing the last layer gives us almost always gives us the worst performance. Unfreezing all the layers gives us the best performance, which implies that the models do need significant amount of retraining, and for generalizable models we need to go beyond simply using pairwise transfer learning models. So simply using one data set for pre-training and one data set for fine tuning. With that we will take a mini recap and stop this lecture. So we saw that material science is limited by data availability on key properties, and we need we can probably use transfer learning to build more robust models to solve or mitigate this data availability problem. We mainly looked at the different handles and different strategies to use transfer learning in an optimal fashion. And to use pairwise transfer learning in an optimal fashion here. So we found that random sampling is good. Models typically need higher learning rates during their fine tuning. More fine tuning data definitely helps in training of the models, whereas more pre-training data gives you non-monotonic improvement in performance. So the data sets that are more normally distributed, more pre-training data definitely helps. Those that are more skewed distributed, more pre-training data may not necessarily help in giving better performance in your fine tuned models, right. So you have some non-monotonicity in the performance of models when with respect to increasing pre-training data set size, and we found that unfreezing all layers it definitely helps for transfer learning tasks in materials, right. So now that we have understood how to optimally do transfer learning, in the next lecture we will look at how useful transfer learning is in practice. Can we create more generalizable models or unlock strategies to create more generalizable models, and do we have a practical use case where we can use transfer learning to efficiently predict some useful properties in materials. With that, I thank you all for joining today's lecture. I will see you all in the next one.